that by 2050, over 8 hours of the day, it will be kind of too hot to work. This isn't a partisan or ideological issue per se. It is just a real issue that everyone is going to have to face. Floods of various sizes and severities, kind of 1 in 50-year flood, the 1 in 75, 100-year flood. What can't be observed relatively well are local solutions and adaptations, which is when you look at flooding in rural areas, you actually find that richer households are more likely to live in flood-prone areas. Urban areas, for sure, poorer neighborhoods tend to be more flood-prone. The economic costs of natural disasters and extreme weather events are much lower in rich countries than they are in poor countries. That is, in some sense, I think, $1 million question. Sri Lanka should be investing basically everything into adaptation.
Dr. Jonah Rexer is an applied development microeconomist at the World Bank's South Asia Region Office of the Chief Economist. His research explores how firms and investors navigate difficult markets, and his interests include international finance, the impacts of natural resource wealth, urbanization in emerging economies, and climate change adaptation. Previously, Dr. Rexer was a postdoctoral associate in the Empirical Studies of Conflict Group and a lecturer at Princeton's School of Public and International Affairs. He holds a PhD in Applied Economics from the Wharton School and a Master in Public Administration in International Development from Harvard Kennedy School. He joins us today on our latest episode of Advocata Conversations.
Jonah Rexer, welcome to the Advocata Conversation.
Thank you, Murtaza.
Why don't we first start by you telling us a little bit about yourself?
Absolutely. So I'm Jonah Rexer. I'm an economist at the World Bank South Asia Chief Economist's Office. I've been an economist, a development economist, for 10, 15 years at this point. I joined the bank about 2 years ago. Prior to that, I was a lecturer, a postdoctoral associate at Princeton in the public policy school there. Excuse me. And so I've been in development, I think, for quite some time. I did my undergrad at Stanford, and following that, I spent a couple years in Uganda working on microfinance, RCTs, impact evaluations, and mostly in agriculture. And that kind of brought me really into the development sector and into economic research, more broadly. As we discussed earlier, after that, I did my MPA at the Kennedy School, and kind of expected, I guess, to go into the development sector after that. But I found myself being drawn towards research in that process. I worked with some great professors there, and so I decided to do a PhD after that. So I did my PhD at Penn in economics, and just continued to work on development topics. My specialty during the PhD was actually in political economy. So I did a lot of work on the political economy of growth and development, and in particular the role that conflict plays in preventing or kind of stymieing growth. So I did a lot of field work in Nigeria at that time, and wrote a couple of papers about the political economy of Nigeria's oil sector, which as you are probably aware is quite a thorny topic. Published a few papers on that. And then kind of continued the academic path to Princeton, where I continued to work on conflict issues. At the bank, so kind of made the transition out of academia, which I think was, given the state of the market today, probably a good transition for myself. And at the bank, I've worked on just a wide variety of issues. This is actually the first time at the bank that I've been working on South Asia. I had basically no experience in the region before that, so it's really been kind of a crash course in getting to know all the countries. I've traveled here several times. I guess this is my second time in Colombo. And yeah, I've worked on just like a wide range of issues at the bank, from gender and female labor force participation, to climate change, which we're going to discuss today, to more recent work, which we're going to be presenting at a few other places on this trip on the impact of AI, artificial intelligence, on the labor market. So it's a wide range of stuff, generally kind of around issues with jobs and labor markets in developing countries. That's a focus of ours at the bank these days, because we think that kind of creating jobs is really the big challenge of the next century for development, and particularly in this region. So that's kind of a background. It's really, I'm a bit of a jack of all trades in that sense. I've worked on lots of different development topics. I've worked in several different continents, and and now I'm here. So thanks for having me.
Welcome. So what kind of kindled your interest in economics?
That's a great question. And I would say, I've been interested in development more generally since undergrad, and to me, I was drawn into economics through that lens. And I think there's a great paper by Lucas that kind of says that once you think about kind of the vast differences in income per capita across countries, it's hard to think about anything else. And that really resonated for me. Certainly when I went to Uganda, one of the poorest countries in the world, coming from a relatively upper middle class life in New York, that was certainly really eye opening. And those per capita income differences, it's one thing to see them in the data, but it's another thing to see them in person. And I do believe that once you start thinking about those and why global inequality is so vast, and how we can get kind of poor countries to grow, it's hard to think of anything else. But then it also becomes immediately apparent, I think, that economics is the thing that you want to study, right? And that there are a whole host of kind of different market failures and political failures that lead to kind of persistent poverty and underdevelopment across the world. And so that really drew me in, that big question. And in the process of thinking about that big question, you end up being drawn to and answering many small questions, which I think ultimately hope to aggregate up into a kind of a body of knowledge that can help us make better policy, right? And so that's really what pulled me in. I also had the benefit at the Kennedy School of having some really fantastic advisors who kind of pushed me to do research. Because it's one thing to kind of think about policy. It's certainly a completely other thing to think about generating new knowledge and doing research and trying to ask kind of novel questions that hopefully contribute to kind of our knowledge about development. So had some great mentors who pushed me in that direction. And yeah, ever since, I think it's become kind of an obsession. I don't think about much else these days.
Interesting you talked about the Kennedy School, because the Growth Lab at the Kennedy School worked with Sri Lanka in 2016 to 2018. It was funded by the Soros Foundation, and two to three professors, Ricardo Hausman, Matt Andrews, and Robert Lawrence, they all worked on Sri Lanka. Did you interact with any of them?
Yes, I did take Ricardo Hausman's course on growth diagnostics, which I found to be kind of a useful applied methodology for understanding where a country is at a given moment and what kind of the binding constraints to growth are, where policy should focus. Actually, funny enough, I mean, this was almost a decade ago at this point, but I did my kind of my capstone project in that course on Sri Lanka.
How did you?
I did okay. I think it was a way for Ricardo Hausman to source ideas on what were the constraints, because it was during the engagement that they were having with the Sri Lankan government. So that was kind of my first exposure with kind of anything related to Sri Lanka, and little did I know I would be here, a decade later, working on Sri Lanka and the South Asia region more generally, and all the kind of many challenges that the region faces.
You mentioned about the bank's focus on jobs and growth. You know that they are going to do an in-depth report on Sri Lanka on jobs and growth.
Yeah.
I was asked to also be a review of the concept note. Will you be working on that?
We'll probably be giving comments on it. Okay. Typically at the bank, there are lots of teams doing lots of work on different things. Our role at the Chief Economist's office, we do our own research, but we also are asked to comment on all of this type of stuff that comes from many different teams in South Asia, whether that's operational projects, whether it's reports like that. If they kind of, we have many degrees of kind of quality control internally at the bank for anything that goes out to the public. And so we are typically one of those layers in South Asia. So I've heard of that report. I don't know much about what's actually going to be in it because I haven't seen the concept note. But we'll definitely, our team will probably be reviewing it for sure. Yeah.
So today's conversation is about the book that you have co-authored, From Risk to Resilience, Helping People and Firms Adapt in South Asia. So as a segue to our conversation, I thought I'd read the first paragraph from an advanced praise. Poor people are poor because markets fail them and governments fail them. Governments intervene to correct market failures such as externalities of public goods, but these in turn create governance failures such as unaccountable service providers or elite capture of public resources. The challenge of poverty reduction is to design actions that correct government failures without recreating the market failures the policies were meant to address, and vice versa. This has been written by our own Shanta Devarajan, who, as you know, was a very senior economist at the World Bank and now a professor at Georgetown. So that basically kind of says something about your work in Uganda also, that people are poor because of poor policy. Why did you decide to work on this report?
That's a good question. I mean, I think that there are two, I think, key points about the report. One is simply kind of the motivation for why it's important to work on this. And the other, I think, is the somewhat novel approach that we take to this question of climate adaptation and resilience, which I think Shanta, alluded to in his comments. So let me talk about both of those 2 points. Just I brought a couple numbers with me to illustrate really the kind of massive risk economically that climate change poses to the world, but particularly to South Asia, which by many measures is one of the most climate affected parts of the world. So, by 2030, which is only, just a few years out at this point, 90% of South Asians will be exposed to, some form of extreme heat. About 20% will be exposed to flooding risk. In Sri Lanka, temperatures have gone up by about 1.5 degrees Celsius since the 60s. And these are kind of unequal burdens, right? What we find in our research, actually, in the report, is that in particularly in urban areas, the hottest places tend to be kind of 20-30% poorer than cooler places, right? So the poor are kind of disproportionately exposed. Now, this wouldn't necessarily be a huge concern from an economic standpoint if there weren't very large kind of economic costs to rising temperatures and increasing extreme weather events. In Sri Lanka, for example, some folks have estimated that by 2050, over 8 hours of the day, it will be kind of too hot to work, right? There's a variety of studies which we review in the report that have estimated relatively large kind of negative labor productivity effects of heat on the order of between kind of 5 and 10% productivity losses for every degree Celsius increased. You see very similar estimates, again, in that 5 to 10% range, about 7%, in fact, for the agricultural productivity losses from a degree Celsius of heat. So, for example, IFPRI estimates about a 7% loss in crop output by 2050 for South Asia. These are under kind of moderate climate scenarios. What that means is, and we do this in the report, we estimate kind of these are kind of the two main mechanisms that we think climate change will lead to kind of reduced growth and increased poverty. We estimate about a 7% drop in GDP for Sri Lanka, which is similar to the South Asia estimate in a macroeconomic model based on kind of business as usual climate scenarios where the temperature warms by about an additional 1.5 degrees by 2050. So these are, these are really important numbers. I mean, 7-10% doesn't sound that large, but if there was a 7% recession right now, people would feel that, I guarantee you. I mean, that's worse or as bad as kind of the recent economic crisis in Sri Lanka. So we're talking about major economic and productivity effects, and so that's why to study, right? To answer your question, I think it's not just because we kind of care about the environment per se, although the environment has kind of value and benefit in and of itself, but it's more importantly, or perhaps equally importantly, because there are these large economic costs, and because South Asia is kind of disproportionately affected, and within South Asia, the poor are going to be disproportionately affected. So that's kind of point number one. Point number two is kind of why do we address this issue in a slightly different framing, I think, than most other reports on this question. The first point to make on that is that we consider kind of adaptation as a result of these numbers to be kind of one of the top priorities, policy priorities for South Asia, for the world, but particularly for South Asia. And the question then is kind of how do you get to adaptation? How do you kind of make the necessary investments that ultimately offset some or ideally all of those economic damages from climate change? And most of the literature, and I think most of the policy conversation has focused around quite large, top-down solutions to that problem. We just need to increase government budgets to invest in all sorts of infrastructure. For example, like seawalls to prevent sea level rise or things like that, right? And we take a somewhat different approach. Not to say that those infrastructure investments are unimportant, but our approach is to say, well, what if we empowered the private sector, agents in the economy, workers, firms, farmers, to adapt on their own, right? And kind of the corollary of that is, why aren't those agents in the economy sufficiently adapting? What are the constraints that prevent them from kind of realizing the full potential of their adaptive investments? Because what we kind of note is ultimately that, kind of adapting to climate change is a kind of privately beneficial investment for a firm, right? The firm has an incentive to install air conditioning in the factory floor so that its workers don't lose productivity. The farmer has an incentive to adopt, improved flood-resistant seeds so it doesn't lose its crop when the monsoon rains are kind of excessive, right? The question is then, why is that not happening, right? Or not happening sufficiently to kind of offset the cost of climate change based on kind of current trajectories? And that's really the question that we're trying to answer in this book.
So before we dig in deep, you come from the United States, and your president says climate change is not for real. Is it for real?
Yeah, I mean, I think that ultimately the numbers I just shared with you make a pretty strong case. That again, this isn't a partisan or ideological issue per se. It is just a real issue that everyone is going to have to face. And the sooner you kind of figure that out, the quicker you can invest in adaptation measures that will ultimately reduce the long-term economic costs, right? I mean, this is not necessarily about caring for the environment for the sake of that, although again, many people do, but it's really about limiting the economic damages from climate change. And I think the data that I presented, and we share a lot of it in the report, that motivates this problem is relatively incontrovertible, right? Again, in Sri Lanka, we've seen about a 1.5 degree rise in temperature since the 1960s. That's broadly consistent with the global average rise in temperatures, about 1.5 degrees. So this is definitely something that's happening. There are kind of pretty extensive studies, both on the modeling side and also on these economic impacts. And so, without trying to be political about it at all, because of course the World Bank likes to kind of stay out of politics as much as possible, we're going to continue to make these investments in adaptation because we recognize the economic threat that this poses.
So global warming is because carbon is trapped in the atmosphere, and
that's, as far as I know,
right,
what the kind of state of the science says, yes.
And in the case of Sri Lanka, we are further closer to the equator than many of our other South Asian neighbors. And I think there was a chart in the book basically showing the temperature, the average mean temperature, and we are right at the top.
Absolutely.
Is that why the World Bank said that we are probably the country that is most vulnerable from climate change?
That is one reason, yes. So that stat that I gave you about 8 hours per day on average by 2050, that it will be too hot to work in Sri Lanka, that is the highest in the region, that number, that 8 hour a day
and
number.
I saw Afghanistan at only about 2 hours because
Exactly.
they're a more mountainous country.
Exactly. So Sri Lanka is already a very hot country. It's at the equator. And so even the same increase in temperature will have larger impacts here because you're kind of moving towards thresholds where it becomes hard to be productive. And one thing you see in the economic literature on this, which I've contributed to and some of which is in the book, a lot of which we review, is that the effects of temperature on output of all sorts, whether that's labor productivity, agricultural productivity, or other, tend to be nonlinear. They tend to kick in really once average temperatures hit kind of the high 30s Celsius. And so again, if you're already a hot country, you're closer to that point. And so the kind of marginal effect of a 1 degree centigrade increase in temperature can be quite large economically. Yeah.
So one negative outcome of high temperatures is that the air expands and can hold more water. And then the intensity of rain increases, which creates flooding. There is also another chart about flood proneness.
Yes.
And it shows the eastern side of Sri Lanka fairly flood prone. Can you comment a little bit about floods?
Yes, absolutely. So the map that you're referring to from the report, essentially what we did was we kind of plotted the predictions from kind of a state-of-the-art climate flood model, which predicts floods of various sizes and severities over various return periods, as they call it. So the kind of 1 in 50-year flood, the 1 in 75, 100-year flood. And of course, over all of those metrics, there's going to be an increase in flooding severity across the board. Sri Lanka is particularly exposed just in part because it's, at least in the coastal areas, it's a low-lying island nation, right? And so there's definitely going to be increased flooding from sea level rise and from rainfall, right? So the thing about climate change is it ultimately has all of these different channels by which it affects weather, and flooding is kind of a very common outcome. We see it in India, we see it in Pakistan. Pakistan in particular has been hit with really devastating floods in recent years, and we're going to, I think, continue to see it in Sri Lanka as well.
So what differentiates this report from many of the other work on climate is, I think you took a very, very rigorous approach with data. That not only did you have new surveys to collect data, but you're using a lot of satellite data. From Meta, you're using data. A lot of quantifiable approaches you are taking. Is this because there's a lot more data available? What was the reason that you became so rigorous?
That's a great question. And I think that there are, in terms of the data landscape on this issue, it's increasingly the case that we have spatially granular, very disaggregated, down to kind of the 500 meter squares all over the world, data on climate outcomes, so temperature, precipitation, flooding. So a lot of that data does come from satellite data. It comes from modeling of weather stations. So weather station coverage has also improved pretty dramatically in many countries. So we're in an environment now where we have spatial data products that are more granular and more comprehensive and cover more climate outcomes than kind of ever before. So that's great. That allows us to say something when we link that data up with economic data at the local level, whether that's data on firms or households and their behavior, their productivities. It allows us to say something about that. The piece that was missing, I think, and this is an important part of the report, actually it's kind of the core of the report, is data on how firms, households, farmers are actually adapting to climate change. That's data that's quite a bit more difficult to find. It's not just out there being collected in all of these climate science approaches, because that's social and economic data that someone has to design a survey and go collect. So we kind of got at that problem in two ways. The first thing we did is we just reviewed the literature, the economics literature, and there's been a fair amount of work on this, on how households and firms adapt to climate change. Now, most of those studies come from existing data sets, household surveys, firm censuses, things like that. And as a result, these are not data sources that are tailored to studying adaptation. For example, in the context of households, there's a few margins of, let's say, climate adjustment or adaptation that are easy to observe in standard household surveys like the type that the Sri Lankan government collects. One of those would be what sector of work you're working in, right? If agriculture is really vulnerable to increase in heat, then you might shift to another sector, right? Another commonly studied phenomenon is migration in response to heat or flooding. Those are things that can be observed relatively well in existing data. What can't be observed relatively well are local solutions and adaptations that, again, are not, these surveys are not designed to capture. Like, are people adopting, flood-resistant or heat-resistant seeds? Are people upgrading their buildings, their housing structures, their firms to cope with climate change? Are firms buying air conditioners? Are they investing other sort of capital goods to combat the effects of climate change? Those data points are just not really out there. And so ultimately what we did, and I think this is kind of the innovation of the report, I suppose, is we ran a variety of surveys in these contexts. So we had surveys in Pakistan, in India, and Bangladesh, all over the region, where we surveyed firms, farmers, workers, households, and tried to understand, just what they're doing, just as kind of on a descriptive level, how are households and firms adapting to climate change, and is it working, right? And so, I think we contribute in that way to get a much more granular picture of these adaptation mechanisms than was previously kind of available in the literature when we had to rely on these just existing data sources.
What I gathered from your book is that the effects of climate change are not equal, that there are a much more vulnerable part of the population. Can you speak about that?
Absolutely. So I think that there are two components to that. One is unequal exposure. So are poor people more likely to live in areas that are disproportionately affected by climate change? And the other is unequal kind of resilience, let's say. So let's first talk about exposure. It's certainly the case, this is indeed what we find, that there's a lot of inequality in who's exposed to climate. So throughout the report, we look at heat and floods as kind of the two main big climate trends that are likely to affect the region. And what we did to study this question is we took, you mentioned this earlier, data from Meta. So Meta has an incredible set of data products that they release to the public. It's a really wonderful initiative. And this particular one is called the Relative Wealth Index, where you're able to measure wealth, or kind of a predicted wealth score, at a very spatially granular level. And this comes from Meta's internal data, where they train machine learning models to predict people's wealth. And then they project that down to kind of basically cover the entire world. So it's a really amazing data set. And as you might have guessed, you can link that up very easily with the climate data, with the data on rainfall, flooding, and temperature. And so that's what we do. And ultimately, you just kind of look at the correlations that you find there and ask the question, is it true that the hotter places, the places that are getting hotter faster, the places that are exposed to floods tend to be disproportionately poorer? And with some nuances and caveats, I would say that yes, we do find that. As I mentioned earlier, it's about 20 to 30% poorer, the hottest places in South Asia, relative to kind of the average heat. So it certainly seems to be the case that poor people are more exposed. There's one interesting exception to that, which is when you look at flooding in rural areas, you actually find that richer households are more likely to live in flood-prone areas in rural areas across South Asia. And kind of there's many ways one could interpret that, but we interpret that as kind of reflecting the effects of flooding on agricultural productivity and fertility, because these floodplains, particularly in India and Pakistan, tend to be the most fertile agricultural regions as well. So that's kind of the one exception to that rule. In urban areas, for sure, it looks like poorer neighborhoods tend to be more flood prone, and that is very consistent with what you might think, kind of when you think of informal settlements in cities that are kind of on the margins of the city, tend to be in flood prone regions. So that's the exposure piece. The second question is it true that conditional on getting hit by a certain shock, the poor are kind of less able to cope with it? And that seems reasonable as a broad conjecture. It's very much true that at kind of a national level across countries, richer countries tend to tend to be less sensitive in their economies to natural disasters, right? The economic costs of natural disasters and extreme weather events are much lower in rich countries than they are in poor countries. And that's, again, it's a problem of adaptation, right? In some sense, income and development is really the best form of adaptation, right? And that's also true on the micro level within countries in the surveys that we collect, right? It's certainly true that poorer households are less able to adapt. That's something that comes out, I think, many times in the book.
So in Sri Lanka, especially in the city of Colombo, we can see that the poorer areas are subject to far greater flooding. Mm-hmm. We have a river here called Kalania, which goes through Colombo city. And historically, the poorer areas have been on the banks of the river. Yeah. So I would presume that the land is cheaper there because it's prone to flooding, and that is why they live there. Now, with regard to hotter areas, is it again because nobody else wants to live there, or they're poor because it's hot?
That's a great question. And it's ultimately a question that you can't answer just by looking at the correlations between these two variables, right? You know, you're asking kind of a causal versus correlation question. We think
and
that
also the direction, right? What causes what?
Exactly. We think that the relationship between heat and poverty is both reflects selection, that mechanism that you just mentioned, that those areas might be cheaper, they're less desirable to live, that's where poor people can afford, but also treatment, as we would say, or kind of the causal effect of heat, because we know that heat has a negative causal effect on productivity, on wages, on labor supply. I was actually in India last week, and I was talking to some fellow researchers who are at the IIMB, the Indian Institute of Management in Bangalore, who are working on a study that shows really negative effects of heat on labor supply. So we know that there are these direct causal effects, but those I don't think can fully explain this relationship, right? There's certainly kind of a selection aspect to it as well. Sure.
If we can now move on to adaptation or the coping mechanism. So in your book, there are two, one what you call autonomous, mm-hmm. and the other one directed.
That's right.
So explain to us what autonomous means.
So autonomous adaptations, you can think of these as kind of the normal responses that agents in the economy take to the changing incentives and price signals that climate change will present to them. So for example, if a firm, if inputs become more costly to a firm because their suppliers are affected by climate change and they go out of business, the firm will switch to different suppliers or using different inputs that are kind of near substitutes, right? Similarly, if a household is in agriculture, and we know that agriculture tends to be more heat sensitive than other sectors, that household might switch its labor supply into another sector, or it might migrate, for example. Those are what we would call autonomous adaptations. Basically just agents in the economy following their incentives and ultimately reallocating their labor, their inputs, their consumption habits to kind of align with the relative price changes that are generated by climate change. Now, what's interesting about autonomous adaptation is again, there's no government in that process. The role of government, I think we argue in that process, is to make it as frictionless as possible for agents to do that, to make it easy to switch jobs, to make it easy to borrow, to invest in some sort of resilient technology, to kind of solve the market failures where they exist, so that we can kind of frictionlessly move goods, resources, labor, et cetera, to where it should go. And in the book, we have kind of a big macroeconomic model where we estimate the impact of autonomous adaptation on the damages from climate change. So that 7% number I gave you earlier is what we would expect, business as usual climate change to do to South Asian economies by 2050. If we, allow for autonomous adaptation, so that's in kind of the no adaptation case. If we allow then for full kind of reallocation of goods and resources and adjustment of prices, we find that number goes down to about 4.5%. So just by kind of facilitating that process and letting agents in the economy do what they're normally going to do, follow their incentives, you can really cut the damages from climate change substantially. Now, the other form of adaptation is what we in the book call directed adaptation.
Before we go there, Jonah.
Yes.
I quote again from Shanta's first paragraph. Poor people are poor because markets failed them and governments failed them. Mm-hmm. And you said that, in your general equilibrium model, the loss is about 7.5%. But if markets are working efficiently, it can be reduced to 4.5%.
That's right.
So what explains the difference?
I mean, there's a whole host of different market failures that kind of prevent us from realizing that 3% kind of gain, right? I think one we kind of keep coming back to in the report is financial markets, right? And there are multiple financial products that should help agents adjust to climate shocks. Obviously, insurance is an important one, right? There are real gaps in insurance markets. In fact, in most countries in South Asia, there's almost no take-up or supply of agricultural weather insurance, for example. And that's hugely important in insuring farmers against these increasing climate risks. So financial markets are a big one. But the other one that we look at, I think, quite a lot in the book is labor markets, right? If there are some kind of frictions that prevent you from moving out of agriculture and into a less heat-sensitive sector, whether that's because migration is difficult, there are high costs to migration, whether it's because you don't have the skills. There's a whole host of things that might prevent you from doing that, or perhaps you just don't even have the information, right? So information is another kind of common market failure that I think applies kind of across all markets, right? That's a very cross-cutting issue that we come back to in the report. So these are just kind of a few examples of the ways in which relatively light-touch government interventions, which might include a combination of deregulating the private sector to allow labor markets to move better, or supporting the financial sector. So I think, again, the insurance example is illustrative because it does imply, in some cases, government intervention in insurance markets. So the big issue in a lot of these insurance markets is simply that the actuarially fair premiums that you would have to charge to insure against climate risks in certain contexts, particularly where risk is very high, are just much higher than most small farmers, for example, will be willing to pay. And the most successful insurance programs, agricultural insurance programs, like India's agricultural insurance program, which has done relatively well at kind of increasing coverage, are subsidized in part by the state. So that's a context in which I think state intervention makes sense. Again, there are other contexts in which deregulation is the solution. There I'm thinking again more about labor markets and reducing frictions to hiring and firing, for example. Those things are what allow firms to grow, particularly non-agricultural firms, who can then absorb more labor that's being released from agriculture as the agriculture sector is affected by climate change. So that's, there's a whole host of things, and we go into a lot more detail in this in the book, that governments can do to kind of facilitate autonomous adaptation.
You alluded to incentives of private agents. One thing you said is that what blunts incentives is property rights. Mm-hmm. That if people don't have a secure tenureship, yes, they are more reluctant to take action because it's not theirs.
Absolutely.
Would you like to comment on the importance of property rights?
Absolutely. So, I think it's pretty well established in the literature that stronger tenure security increases, for example, agricultural investment in your plot, exactly for the reason that you just mentioned, which is that you have a stronger incentive, you get to kind of reap the returns of improving land quality, for example. Those same insights apply to investments in climate adaptation as well. For example, if you need to invest in a particular agricultural practice that's more resilient, or if you need to invest in a new variety of seeds, you're more likely to do that if you have stronger tenure security. One thing we find in the report is it's not just tenure security, but it's also just land holdings that are strongly correlated with adaptation, particularly among agricultural households. So landowning households tend to adapt more, even conditional on controlling for their level of wealth. So it's not just a wealth effect, it's that having access to your own land, which is highly complementary with all these good adaptations that you could make, seems to be very important. So South Asia is a context in which there's a lot of land inequality, there's a lot of lack of tenure security, and so these are areas again in which policy can help, and ultimately I think move the needle on making people more resilient.
So the second channel you spoke about is directed.
Yes.
So what's that?
So directed adaptation in kind of our definition is more the types of adaptations that I mentioned at the beginning of this interview, kind of top-down, government-directed investments, basically. You can think of those as infrastructure investments that might kind of defend against climate catastrophes like flooding. You can think of those as government R&D into new varieties that are of seeds, for example, that are heat resilient. There's a whole host of these types of interventions that ultimately require government investment, some big government projects to kind of attack climate change and make society more resilient. Now, what we find in the report is that kind of the marginal effect of some of these big directed adaptation approaches, once you've already accounted for autonomous adaptation, is actually relatively small. It's not nothing. You can basically gain back an additional 10% of the losses from climate change. So let's say the autonomous adaptation kind of gets you 30-40% of the way back to kind of neutral. You can gain maybe another 10% from these directed adaptations, and ultimately these types of adaptations are often no regret, what we would call no regret investments. Like, you want to invest in agricultural R&D anyway because it's going to improve agricultural productivity, right? So those types of kind of double dividend type investments are the ones you should be looking for. And ultimately, since climate change is happening and it's likely to have these large effects, you're probably not going to regret making big investments in these types of resilience strategies. But again, and what we emphasize in the report, the autonomous adaptation by private sector agents who are just following incentives is going to kind of comprise the lion's share of the resilience in any given society.
So the second largest city in Sri Lanka is Kandy, which is in the hill country. Mm-hmm. And close to Kandy, there is a town whose name slips me at the moment, which is predominantly inhabited by Muslim people. Mm-hmm. And it is very prone to flooding. And it is very political to the population there because you have pretty large floods, which have got worse with climate change. So they are reaching out to the politicians to solve the problem. Now, you talked about the concept of lock-in.
Yes.
Now, this is, when I read your book, I thought about this town. Mm-hmm. So should government intervene and solve the problem of flooding? Yeah. Or is the better solution for those people to simply move out because it's a flood-prone area?
That is, in some sense, I think, $1 million question in this space. And to kind of illustrate that, let me bring up another example, one that we studied in detail in the report that I think sounds very similar to the one you've just raised. And so we did a kind of in-depth study, it's in the book, on northern India, Bihar state, and particularly the Kosi River Basin, which is a very heavily flood-prone region. In 2008, they had these kind of devastating floods that caused billions of dollars in damage and displaced lots of people. It's really bad. But it also kind of gets just annual flooding. It's a regular thing. And again, we think it's going to get worse because of climate change. The World Bank, so the Indian government has invested lots of money over the years in building embankments along the Kosi River that ultimately kind of contain the flow of the river and prevent it from moving too far in one direction or another. But also those embankments can breach, they often do, and that's kind of what causes these catastrophic floods. So the World Bank was contracted or kind engaged with the Indian government to rebuild these embankments recently. And I know many folks who worked on this project. And so we decided, how does this affect private adaptation and kind of local adaptation strategies among rural households in that area? And ultimately, what does that tell us about exactly this question of whether we're kind of creating lock-in by making these big infrastructure investments? And what we found, I think, is somewhat consistent with this lock-in hypothesis. Just to kind of clarify, kind of define that, it's this idea that by investing in large protective infrastructure projects, you're kind of crowding out private adaptations, and one of those adaptations might be people moving away, or at very least moving into other sectors like non-agriculture that are somewhat less exposed or sensitive to flooding or heat or whatever it may be. And so that's basically exactly what we found in the data when we kind of evaluated this World Bank project. What we found was that households tended to migrate less. They tended to engage more in agriculture, to kind of double down on agriculture. They tended to adopt fewer flooding-specific adaptations. So in this context, the main flooding adaptation is kind of either digging drainage canals around your house or raising your home so that the flood waters don't penetrate the house. So various kind of basic building upgrades like that. People do less of that when they're protected by an embankment. They also seem to invest somewhat less in agriculture. That's not entirely clear. So there were a bunch of these kind of expected effects. Now, that does suggest that there's some lock-in happening there. People who otherwise would have migrated are not doing so because of the existence of these embankments. I think that that's a descriptive point. The less clear point is whether that's a good or a bad thing, right? And there, I think that's a political question as much as it is an economic one, and certainly it's really hard to say that you should kind of abandon these communities from a political standpoint. From an economic standpoint, we can think a little bit about what the welfare implications of this are. For example, if this is a relatively unproductive rural area where ultimately people might be better off working in non-agricultural professions or in cities if they migrate, and will ultimately probably be more productive in those different locations and sectors, then yeah, maybe locking in is not a great idea. But then that also means that you're going to treat Colombo very differently than you treat this village, right? And that is a very politically difficult thing to justify, even if it, in some sense, is an economically efficient thing to do, right? So I don't have the answer to this. I think this is a question that should be debated publicly and should be kind of a political decision, because it has a lot to do with how power and resources are distributed within a country. But from kind of an economic standpoint, I do think we need to be, at the very least, kind of cognizant or aware of this possibility of lock-in and of kind of the substitution of adaptation investment between the public and private sector.
Something else that you investigated in the report is this trying to understand beliefs, people's beliefs and knowledge. Can you speak about what you did on understanding people's beliefs?
Yeah, and so just to kind of give some background here, beliefs are really a core aspect of adaptation, right? If you think about it, adaptation, in many cases, for example, my decision to plant a different type of seed, or my decision to install an air conditioner, it's kind of a forward-looking decision, an investment that depends on what I think temperatures or floods will be like 5, 10, 15 years from now, right? And so, those beliefs, those expectations of future climate change are kind of critical in how people make decisions. And that's exactly what we find in the report. We're trying to kind of identify first of all, can we measure those beliefs? Second of all, are they important in determining how people make decisions? And so how do we measure those beliefs? Well, we kind of have a variety of different ways to do this. So as I mentioned, these types of things are not things you just find out there in terms of the data that's kind of generally available. And so again, we had to kind of design these kind of purpose-built surveys just like we did with adaptation. In fact, these were all part of the same kind of survey process, where when we were asking households and firms about their adaptation choices, we were also asking them about their beliefs about future climate change. So one thing that we did in the flooding context is we asked households in Bihar, in India, about how deep they believed the next 1 in 10 year flood, or kind of the worst flood in the next 10 years would be, right? In urban contexts, in non-flooding contexts, in India and Pakistan, we asked firms about how hot they thought the next 10 years would be. How many days above, I think 35 degrees, we said, will there be in a given year 10 years from now? And these are, again, really important parameters to have because they structure how these agents are making decisions. And we found some really interesting things when we looked at this belief data, because the natural thing to do, the first kind of thing to do, is to just compare their beliefs with what the experts say, right? And so, as we've mentioned earlier, we're living in a time where there's just a wealth of data, spatial, granular data on climate outcomes, but also on kind of modeled future projections of flooding, of heat and temperature rise, et cetera. And so what we can do, for example, I'll give you the flooding case, we can take those really granular spatial projections of how deep the worst flood in the next 10 years is going to be at various different kind of periods, and we can compare those to what our respondents said in the survey. We can do the exact same thing with temperature changes as well. And these are the kind of expert projections from all of the fancy climate scientists out there. I don't have a strong belief on whether those are correct or not. I kind of defer to them, right? What we found was quite striking, which is that individual beliefs in our survey aligned pretty closely with the kind of expert consensus at a very granular level. We're talking about matching people in their village with the climate model for their village, right? We're not talking about kind of broader, because of course temperature and flooding are very local. So you have to do this at a hyper-local level. What we found in Bihar, for example, was that people, they underestimated how bad the future flooding would be by a bit, by about around 20%. So you can think of them as being a little bit more optimistic than what the data warranted. In Bangladesh, where we did another survey, and this is a context in which it's coastal Bangladesh, these communities get flooded very regularly. They were just spot on. They knew exactly how deep the next 10-year flood was going to be, again, relative to the climate models. We found similar things for firms in urban areas with heat, actually. They were quite close. They were about 10% off in terms of their projections of how many hot days they were going to experience 10 years from now. So it's really quite amazing. And it goes to show you that agents have very sophisticated beliefs and understanding, particularly, and this is something a point that we make in the report, particularly if they've gone through flooding or heat recently, or they've kind of experienced those events a lot. So the reason I think why people in Bangladesh tended to be a little bit more accurate than those in India was because they get flooded all the time. They're in these really vulnerable coastal communities. There's salt water and ocean water intrusion into their fields basically every year. Whereas in India, you're talking about an environment where there's a catastrophic flood once every 10 or 20 years, And so it's much harder for them to learn and form beliefs with that kind of rare event than it is in Bangladesh, where this is something that's happening all the time. And so, to some extent, the physical environment and the nature of climate change, how it plays out differently in different places, is going to affect how accurate people's beliefs are, which is ultimately going to affect how they invest and make adaptation choices, right? So that's the last bit of the story, is whether these beliefs mattered. And we're joining, I think, kind of a small but growing set of researchers who's studying this question. We find very, very strong correlations between people's beliefs and how much they're investing in adaptation. So people are acting on those beliefs. They have relatively accurate beliefs. They're acting on those beliefs. The kind of remaining open question then is how effective is what they're doing at kind of increasing their resilience? And if it's not very effective, why aren't they doing other things? Or kind of what are the market failures and issues, obstacles that prevent them from making the right choices?
So in the report, you also stress that South Asia is a highly fiscally constrained environment. That the fiscal space is very limited. They are carrying a lot of debt.
Yeah.
A lot of revenues are being used to service interests. So when you factor in the fiscal constraints, what can governments do?
So yeah, I don't need to tell anyone here that governments here are fiscally constrained. I mean, Sri Lanka, most of all, perhaps. But it's not just Sri Lanka, it's across the region. It's one of the highest debt to GDP emerging market regions. Interest payments are really high. I'm not a macroeconomist, but I can look at the charts and say that there's not a lot of fiscal space to invest in adaptation. In addition, the adaptation financing gap is massive. So, I mean, these are some estimates. It's hard to measure this thing. That's the caveat. Basically, how much investment is needed in adaptation versus how much is currently going to it. It's really hard to measure these things, and typically, again, these kind of international metrics, like produced by the UN or others, are not accounting for all of those individual private, kind of autonomous adaptations that I mentioned earlier. But with that caveat, some data that from UNEP that I saw that's in the report seems to suggest that the annual costs of adaptation in South Asia are going to be like $100 billion a year, some huge number. And so far there's been like $6 billion invested in adaptation. So, that's a pretty wide gap, and it's not obvious where that money is going to come from. Now, that kind of raises 2 points. The first point is the point that I think I've been making this entire conversation, which is that private sector adaptation is so crucial. And it's not just because private sector agents have kind of the incentive to adapt, but it's also because of this fiscal space problem that the public sector simply can't afford to kind of find that $100 billion and just lay it out on adaptation in the current kind of fiscal and debt environment. The second point then is that you need to do something about facilitating finance for adaptation, and again that happens at the kind of local firm level. Firms get access to credit to make the right investments. It also happens at a broader kind of national level in financial markets more generally. So we have in the book kind of like a deep dive that was co-authored with our colleagues from SAR environment unit that digs into all of the kind of creative strategies that they're coming up with to kind of crowd in private finance with public finance, right? There are all of these kind of new instruments where the government will take on some of the liability, or donors, right? And that will allow in a particular investment, and that will allow the private sector to kind of increase their investment in some resilience project, right? Now, even those types of facilities are still really small, and they're still mostly focused on mitigation investments rather than adaptation. So that's another really important point to stress here, is that as of now, kind of the global distribution of climate finance, the vast, vast, vast majority is focused on mitigation, right? Reducing carbon emissions. And in our report, we don't say very much about mitigation. We start from the assumption that climate change is already here, and we need to invest in adaptation now. And that hugely out of whack distribution of investments between mitigation and adaptation needs to be moved much more, I think, towards adaptation. So some of it is reallocating existing money, and that's donor money, it's private capital, it's government finances, it's everything, it's across the board. This is particularly true in small countries that don't contribute a lot to global carbon emissions, right? I mean, I think we would all like for every country in the world to bend their emissions curve as fast as possible, but there are trade-offs to these things, right? I think Sri Lanka is really a great example. Sri Lanka is not really making a dent in global carbon emissions. This is a country of what, like 30 million people or something? 20, yeah. So it's tiny, right? Sri Lanka should be investing, it's also highly climate exposed. It should be investing basically everything into adaptation and a lot less into mitigation. So that's just an allocation problem, of existing resources. So a lot of the adaptation gap might be fillable by just reallocating. Now, again, I'm not saying we abandon mitigation by any means, but we should focus our mitigation efforts on the large countries that are likely to have a big impact on global mitigation efforts, whether that's China, the U.S., India to a lesser extent, Indonesia, big countries that emit a lot and are some of which are likely to increase their emissions in the coming years, rather than small countries that are really vulnerable to the effects of climate change and should really be focusing on adaptation.
So, an interesting corollary is Lee Kuan Yew's, one of his books. You have probably heard of Lee Kuan Yew of Singapore.
Of course.
And in that he talks about Singapore is right very close to the equator, and the tropical climate and the humidity.
I think I know the story you're going to tell.
And it's actually about air conditioning.
Yep.
So he says, what a difference air conditioning had. Now, prior to this discussion, I checked what air conditioning penetration in Sri Lanka is at the household level. It's 5%.
Interesting.
And something further is that our government over the years have viewed air conditioners as a demerit good. They have viewed it as a luxury good.
Yeah.
That this is something that the rich use, that it is electricity intensive. Now, when you put your analytical cap and adaptation and how to help the poor, what do you think about that policy?
I think air conditioning is an incredibly effective climate adaptation. There's no question about that. I mean, it's an example that we use again and again, less on the residential side, although that's important, of course, and more on the commercial side. So if you think of a factory, a textile factory, an example that's relevant for Sri Lanka, where in 20 years or whatever, there's going to be 8 hours of the day where it's too hot to work. That's the entire workday, basically. What do you do? How do you keep people productive in that environment? I mean, air conditioning is the obvious solution, right? And until there are other technologies that emerge that can play that role, I think it's the obvious thing. There are other interventions that also make a difference. And so just to finish that point, I think it was a paper in China that showed just like massive productivity gains from installing air conditioning. I think it was in an electronics manufacturing factory. So yeah, it's potentially really transformative. There are other interventions that are potentially a little lower cost, and in some cases more energy efficient, that might also help. So LED lighting is an interesting one because regular lighting really magnifies like ambient heat. And LED lighting is not only more energy efficient, but it also reduces ambient heat. So there was a really nice study from India that showed that installation of LED lights in a factory massively reduced the sensitivity of output to heat, so that negative effect of climate change. So it's not just air conditioning, there are other alternatives, but broadly speaking, technology adoption, yes, like we are very much in favor of technology adoption for reducing the impacts of climate change. In fact, we did a review of kind of all of the studies that have been done on the effectiveness of different kind of adaptation interventions. That's in the report too. And from each of these studies, we formed this quantity we call the adaptation ratio. And you can think of this as like the share of climate damages that are offset by a given adaptation. So in the example I gave earlier, if Sri Lanka is about to lose about 7% of GDP from climate change, the autonomous adaptation gets you back to 4%. The adaptation ratio is 3/7, right? It's about 40%. The adaptation ratio for technological solutions, including air conditioning, among many other things, is like 70%. It's by far, on average, across lots of studies across the world, by far the most effective, or one of the most effective adaptation strategies is just adopting technology. So getting technology into the hands of people, firms, et cetera, whether it's air conditioning or many other things, is I think going to be really one of, if not the most important way to kind of tackle this problem.
So we have been chatting for over an hour.
Do you
have any concluding recommendations to
Yes.
policymakers?
I do, in fact. So I think we think about policy in two ways in this report. There's the set of things you can do that are specifically focused on climate change, whether that's standing up and supporting weather insurance markets, things like that, or these bigger kind of top-down investments, right? Those are kind of climate-specific policies. And in the report, we provide many, many examples of the types of policies that will be useful there. In general, we note that governments should keep in mind these lock-in effects, these crowding out substitution effects, and try to invest in things that are generally kind of these no-regret investments. But there's also another set of policies that have nothing to do with climate change per se, but that we view as really important to kind of increasing resilience, and in some sense, maybe even more important than kind of the targeted policies. So, for example, we know that kind of growth, development is really kind of the best antidote to climate change. And in some sense, development is the best form of adaptation. So anything that a government can do to increase economic growth, to increase firm productivity, is going to be a good thing, right? As I mentioned earlier, a lot of financial market frictions, for example, solving financial market failures. Again, that's good for growth more generally, but it will also help increase resilience. An important point that we kind of make here is it's not all about just facilitating the private sector, although that is a huge part of it. It's also about providing core public goods. So, for example, better roads and bridges, so people can access jobs and markets even when there's a flood or a natural disaster. Better health clinics, so that the mortality impacts of heat are lessened. There's really ample evidence that all of these investments in connectivity, in basic public goods, are hugely important in increasing your resilience, even for like a given level of development, right? And so those are just basic development policies that governments should be doing anyway, right? Providing kind of core public goods, but they're also going to massively increase, societal resilience to negative climate shocks. And so you can really think about, again, doing the kind of climate-specific things, as well as kind of the broad cross-cutting things that are going to affect growth and development more generally.
On that note, thank you very much, Jonah.
Thanks,
That's
Murtaza.
a lot of stuff for us to absorb. And we'll assure you that a lot of the contents of today's conversation will be socialized so that it can be absorbed in bite size.
Okay.
Thank you once again.
It was dense, I know.
Yeah. Thank
really
you once
enjoyed this,
again
Thank
for
you.
coming over.
Thank you so much for having me.
Likewise.